If you were a black boy coming of age in the 70s or 80s, you remembered the phone call that made your stomach drop before anybody said a word. Maybe it was your mother picking up the receiver, twisting the cord around her finger, going quiet in a way that told you this was about you. Maybe it was your father's face when he found a note in your jacket pocket, a name on it that didn't sound like anybody from around the block. That stillness in a house, usually loud with cousins and gospel records, meant a conversation was coming, and you already knew the subject. And somehow that memory leads to something smaller, the way you practiced walking a girl to her locker without anybody from the neighborhood catching you. You timed your steps so you'd blend into a hallway that never quite let you disappear. You were good at that back then, moving between two worlds like you carried a passport nobody else could see. Today, we're going back to that corner of growing up black in Generation X, where love and identity and community expectation all sat at the same table. None of them ever got fully comfortable with the others. We'll walk through bringing a white girlfriend home for the first time and what your boys said about it Monday morning. We'll get to what your grandmother said with her eyes, even when her mouth stayed closed. There's a memory of a school dance waiting for you a little later, and another one about a front porch that still sits heavy in my chest. But before any of that, let's start where it always starts, with the neighborhood and what it taught you about who you were supposed to be. Tell me where you grew up and what decade shaped you, because I have a feeling a lot of us were handed the same unspoken rule book. Was it Detroit? Was it Philly? Was it some small town where everybody's business belonged to everybody else? Did your first crush on a white girl happen in junior high, or did it wait until the stakes felt higher in high school? Hold on to that memory, because we're about to walk right into it. Nothing about those years happened in a vacuum, and your sense of yourself as a black boy started long before any girl entered the picture. It started with your father's voice, low and serious, telling you how to carry yourself if police ever pulled you over. Nearly every black boy of that generation had that same conversation, word for word, no matter which city raised him. It started with your mother pressing your collar before church, telling you that you represented something bigger than yourself. Those lessons sat quiet in the back of your mind for years. Then one day, a girl with blue eyes and blonde hair smiled at you in the hallway. Suddenly, those old lessons felt like they were standing right behind you, watching. The first time you actually spoke to her, it probably happened somewhere ordinary. The library, the bus stop, gym class where nobody was paying attention yet. There was something easy about it at first, nothing to do with race at all, just two teenagers laughing about a teacher's bad toupee. You noticed how her laugh sounded different from the girls you grew up with. Not better, just different.
You noticed how you started paying attention to little things. The way she said your name, the way she saved you a seat. For a while in that hallway, none of the bigger world existed at all. Then came the moment somebody saw you together, and the news traveled faster than a fire alarm. By third period, the whole school seemed to know, and you could feel eyes on you in a way that made your collar feel too tight. Some eyes were curious, some amused, some carrying a judgment you didn't have words for yet. Your boys pulled you aside near the lockers, half joking, half serious, asking if you'd forgotten where you came from. You laughed it off in the hallway, because that's what you did back then, but something about the question stayed with you longer than you let on. Going home that same week, you noticed your mother watching you closer than usual, sensing something shifting in her son. Maybe she'd already heard through the church grapevine, because news like that always traveled fast on Sunday phone lines. She didn't say much, just asked careful questions over dinner, testing the water before deciding how to feel. You remember choosing your words the way you'd choose steps across ice, because this conversation mattered more than most. Your father handled it differently, the way fathers of that era often did. A long look, a short sentence carrying more weight than any lecture. He might have told you to respect yourself, to never let anybody make you feel small for who you were. There was love buried inside that gruffness, even when it came out sounding more like caution than encouragement. You understood, even then, that his worry had nothing to do with the girl herself. And somehow, all of this brings back the sound of the barbershop on a Saturday morning, clippers buzzing, men laughing loud enough to shake the windows. If you were dating a white girl back then, the barbershop had something to say about it, guaranteed. Somebody's uncle would lean back in his chair and start talking about history, about struggle, about choosing outside the community. You'd sit in that vinyl chair feeling the weight of an entire generation's opinion pressing on your shoulders. It wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it came from real memory of harder times, but it landed on a teenage boy's chest all the same. That conversation always circled back to a name, an older cousin or family friend who'd walked that same road years before. Whatever happened to him got repeated like a warning wrapped inside a story. Maybe he'd married a white woman and moved away, and her family never accepted him. Somehow his story became a lesson for every boy sitting under those clippers. You'd leave with a fresh cut and a heavier head, carrying questions you didn't know how to ask out loud. That heaviness always followed you straight to the dinner table, where your grandmother sat at the head, quiet in a way that spoke louder than anyone else. She'd lived through things you'd only read about in history class: marches, signs, doors that used to say things doors don't say anymore. Her caution about interracial dating came from someplace deep and hard-earned, rather than simple prejudice. She never said the words outright, but you could feel her watching, weighing, remembering everything. Something in you wanted her approval almost more than you wanted anybody else's in the family. But there were other times, quieter and gentler, when an aunt would pull you aside and tell you love was love. Follow your heart, she'd say, no matter whose hand fit into yours. Those softer voices existed too, reminding you not everybody in the family carried the same fear. School was its own battlefield, one with rules that shifted depending on which hallway and which eyes were watching that day. Other black boys sometimes treated you like you'd switched teams, like loving a white girl meant loving your own community less. That accusation cut deeper than almost anything else you experienced during those years. You wanted to explain your heart didn't work in teams, that liking somebody had nothing to do with betrayal. But words like that rarely landed the way you hoped in a crowded hallway.
Meanwhile, some white kids at school treated the whole thing like a spectacle, whispering behind hands, staring a little too long at lunch. You learned to read a room fast in those years, which teachers looked the other way, which classmates would defend you unasked. That skill, reading a room for safety, became second nature long before you understood you were even doing it. That constant reading of the room reminds me of the school dances, gymnasiums decorated with crepe paper, a DJ playing whatever was popular that year. Walking in with a white girl on your arm felt like stepping onto a stage nobody built for you. Every eye found you the second you crossed the threshold, some faces smiling, others hardening in ways you tried not to notice. You danced anyway, because the music was good and her hand felt warm in yours. For 3 minutes at a time, the rest of the gymnasium simply disappeared. Television back then rarely showed you what you were living through, so you paid close attention on the rare nights it tried. A show might feature an interracial couple for one episode, treated like a special event worth discussing at school the next morning. You and your friends would dissect it like scholars, arguing over whether it felt honest or whether it felt like a stunt. Music carried more truth than television ever managed. Songs about love that crossed lines nobody talked about openly at the dinner table. You'd play those records low in your room, feeling seen by a stranger's voice in a way your own house sometimes couldn't offer. That gap between what you saw on screen and what you actually lived taught you early that your story wasn't being told the way it deserved. I still remember one afternoon that has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything from that time. I had walked a girl named Karen home from school. Nothing dramatic, just talking about nothing the way teenagers do. When we reached her block, her father was outside washing his car, and his posture changed the second he saw us together. He didn't yell, didn't even really say much, just told her to go inside in a voice flat enough to freeze water. Then he looked at me like I had done something wrong simply by existing near his daughter. I walked home alone that day, taking the long way past the corner store, past the church, trying to understand a rejection I hadn't earned. What that afternoon quietly taught me was that some doors close before you even get to knock on them. That lesson, painful as it was, prepared me for a world that wouldn't always meet me halfway. Life kept moving forward the way it always does, and eventually that same neighborhood also produced some of the tenderest moments of those years. There was a corner store where the owner, an older man named Mr. Wallace, never once made you feel strange about who you brought in with you. Places like that mattered more than people realized, small pockets of neutral ground in a world otherwise divided into careful categories. And that thought about neutral ground leads straight to church, because church back then was rarely neutral about much of anything, especially not this. If you brought a girlfriend who wasn't black, whispers started before the second hymn even finished, pews turning slightly, eyes finding you over shoulders. The pastor might mention nothing directly, but you could feel the temperature of the room shift. It was a kind of collective holding of breath that lasted the whole service through. Yet even inside that tension, an usher or a deacon's wife would often smile warmly regardless, understanding love was supposed to be bigger than the categories people built. Those small kindnesses stood out precisely because they were rare, little candles lit inside a room that otherwise felt dim. Looking back now, that whole neighborhood carries a strange beauty in memory, contradictions and all, judgment sitting right alongside genuine love. Somehow, both things were true at once, sitting side by side without ever canceling each other out. The community that raised you with pride was the same one that made your heart's choice feel unforgivable to some. That contradiction never fully resolved itself, not then and honestly not entirely now, but understanding it as contradiction rather than betrayal helped soften its weight over the years. That unresolved feeling brings me back to school in a different way, not the dances this time, but the classrooms themselves. A history teacher once made an offhand comment about interracial couples that stung more than he probably realized. You sat there in your seat absorbing it, unable to respond the way you might have wanted to. Moments like that taught you when to speak and when silence protected you better, a skill plenty of black boys carried past graduation.
But school also gave you allies you never expected, teachers who pulled you aside privately just to check on you. Those small gestures of care meant everything at the time, even if you didn't always say thank you the way you should have. You remembered those teachers for years afterward, long after their names faded from most other memories of that building. Summers brought a different tension entirely, because summer meant cookouts and family reunions. Bringing a white girlfriend to either one felt like walking into a spotlight you never asked to stand under. Aunts would pull you into the kitchen under the pretense of helping carry dishes, asking pointed questions about your intentions. Uncles would watch from lawn chairs with their arms crossed, saying little, but their silence carried its own commentary. You learned to read that silence fluently, the same way you'd learn to read the barbershop in the hallway. And yet, at the very same cookout, some little cousin would run up and hug her leg without a second thought. Children have a way of cutting straight through all that tension too young to understand any of the complicated feelings the adults carried. They reminded everybody present what uncomplicated affection actually looks like before the world teaches them otherwise. Nights after those gatherings often ended with long car rides home, radio playing low, both of you quiet, processing everything that had happened. Those silences taught you something about partnership too, about how two people from different worlds could sit together in discomfort without either one of you running from it. That kind of quiet endurance became its own love language over time, one built more on presence than on words. I still remember one afternoon, years later, sitting on my grandmother's porch long after all of this had settled into something closer to peace. She was older by then, her hands slower, her voice softer, and she started talking about her own younger years. She told me she understood my choices better than she'd ever let on at the time. Her caution back then had come from fear for me, not judgment of me, and fear and love had simply gotten tangled together in her chest. Hearing her say that, so many years after the fact, softened something in me I hadn't realized was still tight. It reminded me most of the resistance I felt growing up wasn't really about hatred at all. It was about a generation trying desperately to protect the ones coming up behind them. Sitting there with her, watching the street lights flicker on one by one, I understood something about time and forgiveness I couldn't have understood as a teenager. Thinking about her words now makes me consider how much all of us carried without even realizing the weight of it. We were teenagers navigating something bigger than us, something built out of history none of us had chosen. We were simply trying to love somebody without it becoming a referendum on our whole identity. Some of those relationships lasted, some ended quietly, some ended loudly, but every one taught the boys involved something permanent about themselves. And maybe that's really what all of this was about underneath the surface. Not the girls themselves, not even the neighborhoods or the barbershops or the porches. It was the long, complicated process of a black boy figuring out how to hold on to himself while the world kept asking him to choose a side. If any of this brought back a memory of your own, I'd love to hear it, whatever corner of the country you grew up in. Maybe you have a barbershop story or a porch story or a school dance you still think about more than you'd like to admit. Share it in the comments, because stories like these have a way of connecting people who never even met. Your memory might be exactly the one somebody else needed to read today. And if this kind of reflection means something to you, stick around, because there are more of these conversations coming. There are more porches waiting, more Saturday mornings, more quiet truths about growing up black. It was a time that shaped so many of us in ways we're only now finding the words for. I'd rather walk through it slowly, together, than rush past a single memory worth keeping.